I always believed that family was unshakable, that blood bound us in ways no force on earth could sever. But I was wrong. It started with a funeral, my father's. The old man had been the pillar of our family, and when he passed, he left behind more than just a grieving wife and children. He left behind a storm of secrets that had been kept buried for far too long. The first crack appeared during the wake. My cousin, Daniel, the golden boy of our family, stood at the bar with my wife, Emily, whispering about something. Their heads close, eyes darting toward me like children caught stealing cookies. It was subtle, but a gut feeling told me something was wrong. I ignored it at first. Grief can make a man paranoid. But then, after a few drinks loosened people's lips, my uncle muttered something I wasn't supposed to hear. "Funny, how much little Oliver looks like Daniel, huh? My son." I felt the words crawl down my spine like a spider. Oliver was 6, and in those 6 years, I had never questioned his resemblance to Emily or myself. But now, staring across the room at my cousin, at the sharp cheekbones, the dimpled chin, the hazel eyes identical to my son's, my world began to tilt. That night I couldn't sleep. I spent hours flipping through old photos, comparing faces, searching for a lie hidden in the innocent snapshots of birthdays and holidays. Then, I found it. A picture from a Christmas party years ago, Emily sitting too close to Daniel, her hand on his knee. I had been standing just a few feet away, blind to it all. The next morning, I confronted my mother. "Tell me the truth." She sighed, her face aging a decade in that moment. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "One mistake, and we all thought it was best to leave it buried." The room spun. "We? Who the hell is we?" "Everyone," she admitted. "Your father, your uncle, your sister. We all knew." My heart pounded so hard it drowned out the silence. "You let me raise another man's child, my cousin's child." Tears welled in her eyes. "You love Oliver. That's what matters." I stormed out, drove aimlessly through the city, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I finally returned home, Emily was waiting. "You know," I said. She didn't deny it, just looked down at her hands. "I wanted to tell you, but your father begged me not to. He said it would destroy you." "It has destroyed me." She broke down then, sobbing apologies that couldn't undo 6 years of lies. And Daniel? He couldn't even meet my eyes when I confronted him. He had the nerve to say, "I didn't want to hurt you, man." I walked away before I did something I'd regret. The weeks that followed were a blur of lawyers, DNA tests, and bitter confrontations. The results confirmed what I already knew. Oliver wasn't mine. But the strangest thing? I couldn't unlove him. He still reached for my hand when he was scared. Still called me daddy with that same innocent smile. So I made a choice. I cut my wife out of my life. I cut my cousin out of my life. I cut the family that had betrayed me out. But Oliver, I couldn't walk away from him. Blood be damned. He was my son. And if there was one thing I had learned from my family, it was that secrets don't define love. Choices do. What do you think? Did you expect that ending? The divorce was brutal. Emily fought me on everything: money, property, custody. She swore she never wanted to hurt me, but her actions told a different story. When the DNA test confirmed Oliver was Daniel's, she tried to use it against me, arguing that I had no legal claim over him. That was the first time I ever saw true fear in Oliver's eyes. "Daddy, you don't want me anymore?" he had asked one night, his tiny voice trembling. I knelt down, looking him straight in the eyes. "You will always be my son," I promised, "no matter what." Emily wasn't prepared for the fight I was willing to bring. I didn't care about the house, the car, the accounts. I cared about Oliver. My lawyers found a loophole, 6 years of raising him, my name on the birth certificate, and the fact that Daniel had never once tried to claim him gave me a chance to secure joint custody. But the real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was with my family. I cut them off, completely. No calls, no visits, no apologies accepted. Daniel tried once, showing up at my doorstep looking like hell. "I messed up. Man," he said. "I swear I never meant—" I slammed the door in his face. But the real betrayal wasn't just his. It was the people who had sat across from me at dinner for years, knowing the truth and saying nothing. My own mother, my sister, my uncle. "You. Let me live a lie," I told them when they tried to explain. My mother wept. "We thought we were protecting you," I scoffed. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting your own comfort. You just didn't want to deal with the consequences." I walked away from them that day, and I never looked back. As time passed, things settled into something resembling normal. I built a new life, one without my past weighing me down. But secrets have a way of rotting people from the inside out. One night, about a year after the divorce, my phone rang. It was my sister. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "It's Mom," she said, her voice thick with panic. "She's in the hospital." I hesitated. I had sworn them off, but she was still my mother. When I got there, she looked small in the hospital bed, her once strong frame weakened. She had suffered a mild heart attack. The doctors said she would recover, but she wasn't the same. She reached for my hand, eyes full of regret. "I should have told you," she whispered. "I should have done the right thing. For the first time in years, I saw her not as the woman who betrayed me, but as a mother who made a terrible choice out of fear." "I forgive you," I said, though the words burned on the way out. Not for her, but for me. Years passed. Oliver grew. One day when he was 10, he came home from school quiet, his usual energy dulled. "What's up, bud?" I asked. He hesitated, then finally said, "Someone at school said Uncle Daniel is my real dad." My stomach tightened. "And what do you think?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he shrugged. "I think you're my dad." I pulled him into a hug, because in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. The past has a funny way of refusing to stay buried. Years passed. The bitterness faded, but the scars remained. I moved on, found love again, built a new home for Oliver and me. My world, once shattered, was pieced back together, though some cracks would never fully heal. Then, one evening, the past came knocking, literally. It was Daniel. I hadn't seen him in years, and he looked different. Gaunt, older, like life had beaten him down. He stood on my doorstep, eyes sunken with guilt. "I need to talk," he said. I should have slammed the door in his face, should have sent him away like I did all those years ago. But something in his expression, the desperation, the weight of something unspoken, made me step aside. He walked in, glancing around the house. "You kept it," he murmured, nodding toward the framed picture of Oliver on the mantel. "Of course I did," I said. "He's my son." Daniel flinched. I know, and that's why I'm here." I crossed my arms. "Say what you need to say and leave." He swallowed hard. "It's about Oliver. My blood ran cold." "What about him?" Daniel hesitated. "There's something you don't know. Something no one told you." My fists clenched. "Another secret?" He nodded, shame twisting his face. "It's about the DNA test." I froze. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. "What? About it?" I demanded. Daniel exhaled shakily. "It was faked." Silence. A deafening silence, heavy with the weight of those 3 words. "What?" My voice was barely a whisper. I didn't sleep with Emily," he said, his voice cracking. "Not like that. We got drunk once, kissed, that's all. But when she found out she was pregnant, she panicked. Your father panicked. They were worried. Worried you'd leave, that it would tear everything apart. So they lied. Your father convinced Emily to fake the test, to make sure you wouldn't question it." I stared at him, the room spinning. "No," I muttered. "That doesn't make sense. The test, it was switched before you ever saw it," Daniel admitted. "I only found out recently. Your mom told me, right before she passed." The air left my lungs. Oliver was my son. He had always been my son. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the couch to steady myself. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, that's not possible. Why the hell would they do that to me?" Daniel's eyes were wet with regret. "They thought they were protecting you. Your dad, he was afraid of what would happen if the truth ever came out. That Emily had been unfaithful, just not with me." I could barely hear him over the roar in my head. "Then who?" My voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. Daniel's face twisted, with something unreadable. "I don't know. I wanted to hit him, wanted to scream, to break something, to burn down every lie that had been built around me. Instead, I turned away, staring at Oliver's picture. My hands trembled. 6 years of believing he wasn't mine. 6 years of grief, of doubt, of questioning every moment I had spent loving him. And all of it had been for nothing. I had been his father all along. I turned. Back to Daniel, my voice steady but cold. "Get out," he nodded. He had expected that. "I'm sorry," he whispered before walking out the door. That night I sat by Oliver's bed watching him sleep. I ran a hand through his hair, my heart heavy with all the stolen years. The anger, the resentment, it would never fully go away, but neither would my love for him, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The weight of the truth sat heavy on my chest, pressing down with every breath. For 6 years I had believed the worst, that my son wasn't mine, that my wife had betrayed me with my own blood, that my entire family had conspired to keep the truth from me. And now I was drowning in a different kind of betrayal. They hadn't just lied. They had stolen years from me. I could still hear Daniel's voice in my head. The test was faked. "Oliver is yours." The worst part? I believed him. It explained everything. The nervous glances, the hesitant half-truths, my father's sudden insistence that I had to stay with Emily, that I had to be the bigger man. He was protecting a lie, one he thought would save me but had only broken me instead. I had spent years resenting a child who had done nothing wrong. I had looked at my own son and seen another man's shadow. And now, I had to make it right. The next morning, I walked into a clinic and ordered a new paternity test. This time, I watched every step of the process. 3 days. That's how long it took. 72 hours of pacing my house, of staring at the phone, of trying to figure out what I would do if, by some cruel twist of fate, Daniel was wrong, and... Then the email came. I opened it with shaking hands. 0.99% probability of paternity. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A strange sound escaped my throat. Something between a laugh and a sob. I pressed a hand to my forehead, trying to process what this meant. Oliver had always been mine. He had been mine from the moment he was born. All the guilt, the doubt, the anger I had carried for years had been for nothing. I had to tell him. That night, I took Oliver out for ice cream. It was late and he was in his pajamas, but I didn't care. We sat on the hood of my car, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He licked his cone, completely oblivious to the storm in my chest. "Hey, bud," I said after a while. He looked up. "Yeah?" There's something I need to tell. You. I took a deep breath. I made a mistake. A big one. His forehead scrunched up. Like what? I hesitated, then decided the truth was all that mattered. For a long time, I thought. My voice caught in my throat. I thought you weren't my son. Oliver blinked at me. What? I forced myself to keep going. I thought someone else was your dad. I was wrong. I should have never doubted it, but I did. And I need you to know, no matter what happened, no matter what people said, I have always loved you. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his ice cream like it held the answers. Then, finally, he shrugged. I knew you were my dad. Tears burned in my eyes. How? He gave me a small smile. Because you're the one who taught me how to ride a bike. You're the one who made me pancakes when I was sick. You're the one who comes to my games. That's what a dad does. I let out a shaky breath. Yeah, I whispered. Yeah, it is. And just like that, the weight of 6 years began to lift. But the battle wasn't over. I still had a score to settle. My father had orchestrated this deception, thinking he was doing the right thing. But right and wrong aren't decided by fear, and I wasn't going to let him take this to his grave. So the next day, I drove to my childhood home. When my father opened the door, his face went pale. He must have seen the storm in my eyes. We need to talk, I said, stepping inside, and for the first time in my life, I was the one demanding the truth. Should I continue? The confrontation is coming. Blood Ties and Betrayal, Part 6, Spain. That's where my brother had run. That's where he had been hiding while I spent years believing a lie. I booked a flight the next morning. I didn't tell anyone. Not Oliver, not my father, not Daniel. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. The plane touched down in Madrid, the city lights flickering like embers against the dark. The weight in my chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier. I had spent years grieving a betrayal that never was. Now I was standing on the edge of a different kind of betrayal, one I wasn't sure I had the strength to face. But I had come too far to turn back. Michael had to answer for what he had done. It took me 3 days to find him. His name wasn't Michael anymore. He went by Miguel Armanza, a half-hearted attempt to bury his past. But he wasn't careful enough. A few bribes, a few conversations with the right people, and I had an address, a small villa outside Seville. Quiet. Private. The kind of place you disappear to when you don't want to be found. I got there just before sunset. The house was modest but well kept, hidden behind white stone walls. A place for a man who had started over. A man who had left his sins behind. But I hadn't. I knocked. Hard. Footsteps approached, slow, hesitant. Then the door opened, and there he was. Michael, older. His hair grayer, his face lined in ways I didn't remember. He had a glass of wine in, one hand wearing a linen shirt like he had finally embraced the European lifestyle. For a second, his eyes didn't register who I was. Then he froze. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of it. Finally, he swallowed. Nick! His voice was careful, controlled, like a man who knew the past had finally caught up to him. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He didn't stop me. The living room was simple. A bookshelf, a few paintings, a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. No photos of family, no reminders of the life he had abandoned. He set his glass down. How did you find me? I scoffed. Did you really think you could hide forever? His jaw tightened. I wasn't hiding. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. You ran. You ran because you knew what you did. Michael exhaled. I didn't. Don't lie to me. My voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. For the first time, he looked tired, worn. His shoulders slumped. "I didn't run because of what happened," he said quietly. "I ran because I couldn't face it. I couldn't face you." I clenched my fists. "You slept with my wife." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I didn't mean for it to happen." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, well, that makes it better. You didn't mean to betray me?" His eyes darkened. "It wasn't just sex, Nick." I stopped. The room felt smaller. "Don't," I warned. Michael held my gaze. "I loved her." I moved before I could stop myself. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward into the bookshelf. A glass shattered. He groaned, clutching his face, but he didn't fight back. I grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the wall. My breath was ragged, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You loved her?" I spat. "You loved her? Then why did she stay with me? Why didn't you take her?" Michael's breathing was uneven. "Because she loved you more." I froze. My grip loosened just enough for him to push me away. He wiped blood from his lip, his expression unreadable. "She never planned to leave you, Nick. Not for me. I was a mistake, a regret. And when she got pregnant," he hesitated. "She didn't even consider that Oliver might be mine. It was Dad who planted that seed. He was the one who wanted to control the damage. He made her take that fake test. And I let him, because I was a coward." I shook my head. "You don't get to be the victim here." "I'm not," he said quietly. "I'm just telling you the truth. The truth you should have had years ago." The rage in my chest burned, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was something colder now. Something heavier. I had wanted to kill him. I had wanted to destroy him the way he had destroyed me. But standing there, looking at the man who had once been my brother, I felt nothing but exhaustion. I turned away. "Nick." His voice was hesitant. "What now?" I walked to the door, pausing just before stepping outside. Then I looked back at him one last time. "You live with it." And then I left. The flight home was quiet. When I landed, Oliver was waiting for me at the airport, his arms wide open. "Dad!" I knelt down, hugging him tightly, breathing him in. He was mine, and in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. I had found my brother. I had found my answers. But I wasn't carrying the past with me anymore. I was done with ghosts. I was done with blood ties. All I needed was the family I had chosen. And as I drove home, Oliver chatting beside me, I realized something for the first time in years. I was free. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, my gun on the table, my thoughts a storm inside my skull. Victor DeLuca. That name carried weight. Real weight. The kind that left bodies in rivers and debts unpaid in blood. My father had mentioned him years ago in hushed conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. A man who didn't forgive. A man who collected what he was owed no matter what. And now he thought Oliver was his to collect. Over my dead body. By morning, I had a plan. First, I had to move Oliver. If DeLuca's people were already in town, it was only a matter of time. Before they made a move, I needed to be ahead of them. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Nick, I need a favor." A pause. "What kind of favor?" "The kind where you don't ask questions." Daniel exhaled. "This about Oliver?" Of course, he already knew something was wrong. That was the thing about Daniel. He always had a way of sensing when the storm was coming. "Yes," I said. "Can you take him for a few days? Somewhere safe?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Bring him to me." Oliver was still half asleep when I packed his things. "Where are we going?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. I forced a smile. "You're going on a little trip, bud. Gonna stay with Uncle Daniel for a few days." His brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because I need to handle something." He studied my face like he always did when he knew I wasn't telling the whole truth. He was smart, too smart, but he nodded anyway. Okay, Dad. I ruffled his hair. Good kid. By noon, Oliver was with Daniel, and I was driving back into the city. I had a meeting to arrange, and I knew exactly how to get DeLuca's attention. The club was dimly lit, the air thick with cigar smoke and quiet conversations spoken in languages of power and violence. I walked straight to the bar, ignoring the curious glances, and leaned toward the bartender. I need to see DeLuca, the man scoffed. And who the hell are you? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Slid it across the bar. The bartender frowned, but he opened it. Inside was a single photo of Oliver, and beneath it, in red ink, I had written, "We need to talk. Now." The bartender's face paled. "Wait here," he muttered before disappearing into the back. I didn't wait long. 5 minutes later, 2 men in black suits approached. One of them placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Mr. DeLuca will see you now." DeLuca's office was exactly what I expected. Leather furniture, a bar stocked with expensive whiskey, and a man sitting behind a massive oak desk like a king, on his throne. He was older now, but the danger in his eyes was the same. He smiled when he saw me. "Nicholas." I didn't correct him. He gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit." I did. "Nice photo you left at the bar," he said, picking it up between 2 fingers. "Cute kid. Yours?" I met his gaze. "He's mine," DeLuca smirked. "That's not what Michael told me." I leaned forward. "Michael is a liar, a coward. But I'm not." DeLuca chuckled. "So why are you here, Nicholas?" I exhaled slowly. "Because I'm going to make this real simple for you. Oliver is off limits. You don't call, you don't send your men, you don't even think about him." DeLuca sighed, shaking his head. "That's not how this works. Your brother made a deal. He ran from it. That means someone pays." I clenched my fists. "Then take me." DeLuca raised an eyebrow. "You want blood? Take mine. But if you come near Oliver..." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I will burn everything you have to the ground." DeLuca studied me for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. "You've got fire, Nicholas. I like that." I didn't blink. He tapped his fingers against his desk, considering. "All right," he finally said. "I'll make you a deal." I braced myself. "You do one job for me, one night, one task, and your boy is free, forever." I exhaled. "What kind of job?" DeLuca's smile widened, and that's when I knew I had just stepped into something much, much worse. DeLuca leaned back in his chair, watching me like a man who already knew the outcome of the game. "One job," he repeated, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Do it, and I forget about your son. You have my word, his word," which meant nothing. But I didn't have a choice. I clenched my jaw. "What's the job?" DeLuca's smile widened. He reached into his desk, pulled out a manila folder, and slid it across the table. "Open it." I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I stared at him. "Tell me," DeLuca chuckled. "You always were your father's son. Fine. There's a man in this city who's become a problem for me. A rat, leaking information to people he shouldn't." My stomach twisted. I already knew what was coming next. "I need him gone," DeLuca said simply. "Permanently." I exhaled through my nose, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You want me to kill someone?" DeLuca tilted his head. "You say it like it's a surprise." I looked down at the folder. Slowly, I opened it. A single photo. My breath caught. No. No, no, no. Because I knew this man. Not just knew him. I had trusted him. Daniel. The world blurred around me. Daniel. My brother. The only one who had stood by me when everything fell apart. The man currently watching over my son. DeLuca leaned forward, amusement dancing in his eyes. Not what you were expecting, was it? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. What did he do? DeLuca sighed. Daniel's been working with the feds, feeding them crumbs, just enough to make my life difficult. It's only a matter of time before he hands them something real. I kept my face blank. And you want me to clean up your mess? DeLuca smiled. Not a mess. A test. I frowned. See, Nick, I don't just want this problem gone. I want to know if I can trust you, if you're really willing to do anything for your boy. I clenched my fists under the table. And if I say no? DeLuca exhaled, almost disappointed. Then we go back to the original arrangement. Michael's debt still needs to be paid. And your son, well, he shrugged. He's a valuable little insurance policy. The rage inside me was a slow-burning fire, eating away at my control. I had two choices: kill Daniel, or let DeLuca come for Oliver. Both were impossible, but only one was unthinkable. I took the folder and left without a word. By the time I got back to my car, my hands were shaking. I gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard, trying to force my thoughts into order. I needed a plan, because I wasn't going to kill Daniel, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let DeLuca get anywhere near my son. That left only one option. I had to take DeLuca down for good. I sat in my car, the folder burning a hole in my lap, my mind racing. Daniel. DeLuca wanted me to kill the one person I trusted, the only family I had left that mattered. But there was no way in hell I was pulling the trigger, which meant I had to flip the board. I drove straight to Daniel's safe house, the place he had taken Oliver. It was an old cabin, just outside the city, surrounded by trees and silence. I parked a few yards away and killed the engine. I needed to be careful. If DeLuca had eyes on me, and he probably did, I couldn't let them know what I was about to do. I slipped through the trees, moving quietly until I reached the back door. 3 knocks, our signal. A moment later, Daniel opened the door, his expression unreadable. You look like hell, he said. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. We have a problem, Daniel crossed his arms. Figured. You don't just drop Oliver on me without a damn good reason. I pulled out the folder and tossed it onto the table. Daniel flipped it open. His face barely changed, but I saw the way his fingers tensed. Well, he muttered, this is awkward. I sat down across from him. How long? Daniel sighed, rubbing his jaw. Almost 2 years. The feds don't know much, just enough to make DeLuca nervous. He met my gaze. And now he wants you to end me? I nodded. Silence stretched between us. Then Daniel did something I didn't expect. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. A dark, bitter one. Jesus, Nick. The things we do for family. I exhaled sharply. You got a way out of this? Daniel leaned back, thinking. Maybe, but it won't be pretty. I already knew that. Nothing in my life ever was. The plan, we stayed up for hours, going over every angle. By the time the sun was creeping over the horizon, we had something that resembled a plan. Step 1. Make DeLuca believe I was going through with it. Step 2. Use that. Time to gather enough dirt to put him down for good. Step 3. Survive. The last part was the tricky one, because DeLuca wasn't stupid, and once he realized I had no intention of pulling the trigger, he'd come after all of us. Before I left, I knelt beside Oliver's bed. He was still asleep, curled up under a blanket. Peaceful. I brushed his hair back, swallowing the lump in my throat. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure my son had a future. One that didn't involve men like DeLuca. One that didn't end with him burying me. I stood, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. It was time to go to war. The drive back into the city was quiet. Too quiet. I checked my mirrors. Twice. No cars following. No dark SUVs lurking in the distance. But I knew better than to believe I was in the clear. DeLuca's men were ghosts when they wanted to be, and if I was going to sell this lie that I was ready to kill Daniel, I had to make sure they saw me trying. I pulled up outside an old warehouse on the docks, one of DeLuca's properties. I stepped out of the car and left the engine running. Just in case. The moment I walked inside, I felt it. Eyes on me, the scent of oil and rust hung in the air, thick and cloying. A single overhead light flickered above, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. And then, clap, clap, clap. Slow applause echoed through the space. I turned. DeLuca stood on the metal walkway above, flanked by two of his men. "Nick," he called down. "Didn't think I'd see you back so soon." I lifted the folder. "I've got a plan," he grinned. "Do you now?" I nodded. "But I need time. If I rush this, it'll look suspicious." DeLuca took a step forward, resting his hands on the railing. "How much time?" "A few days." He tilted his head. "And what do you need from me?" I forced a smirk. "Access to Daniel's usual haunts. If I'm going to get close enough to do this clean, I need to know his routine." DeLuca studied me for a long moment. Then he snapped his fingers. One of his men stepped forward, tossing a small burner phone onto the ground at my feet. "You'll get a text with locations," DeLuca said. "I expect results, Nick." I picked up the phone, nodding. "You'll get them." I turned to leave, my pulse hammering. I had sold it, for now, but I had just put a timer on my own life. The clock starts now. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the phone. DeLuca wasn't going to wait forever. I had 2 days. 2 days to destroy a man who had spent decades making sure he could never be touched. If I failed, it wouldn't just be me who paid the price. Daniel.Oliver, everyone I cared about. I took a slow breath and dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the first ring. "That bad?" "Worse," I muttered. "We need to move, now." Daniel sighed. "Then let's get to work." Time was against us. DeLuca had given me 2 days, but I knew better. Men like him didn't wait. He'd have his people watching me, watching Daniel, waiting for any sign that I wasn't going to pull the trigger. And if they suspected even for a second that I was playing them, we were dead, all of us. The setup Daniel and I worked through the night, going over every detail. DeLuca was powerful, but power made men lazy, arrogant. They thought they were untouchable until they weren't. We needed leverage, something that would make the feds move now before DeLuca realized what we were doing. And then, just after 3 a.m., Daniel found it, a file, hidden deep in a secure drive. Bank transactions, offshore accounts, payoffs to dirty cops, judges, politicians. But the real gold? A list of names. People DeLuca had personally ordered to be removed. Some were missing, some were confirmed dead, and one name stood out, Michael Calloway. My brother, DeLuca, hadn't just used Michael. He had killed him. I stared at the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. "He knew," I whispered. Daniel exhaled. "Yeah." Michael hadn't disappeared, hadn't skipped town. DeLuca had gotten rid of him, and now he was trying to take my son. The last piece of Michael left in this world. I curled my hands into fists. "We end this, tonight." The trap by sunrise, we had a plan. I texted DeLuca from the burner phone. "It's done. Meet me at Pier 17 tonight. 10 p.m. His reply was instant. Good boy. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Pier 17 was an abandoned shipping yard. No cameras, no witnesses. The kind of place where men like DeLuca did their worst work. I got there early, parking near the rusted-out warehouses, keeping to the shadows. Daniel was already in position, tucked away in an old maintenance shed, with his laptop. He had sent everything we found to the feds, bank statements, murder orders, proof of everything DeLuca had done. Now we just had to stall. Keep DeLuca talking long enough for them to move, and if they didn't, then we handled it ourselves. The showdown at exactly 10 p.m., DeLuca arrived. 3 black SUVs rolled into the yard, their engines rumbling like thunder. The doors opened and half a dozen men stepped out, weapons visible. Then, finally, DeLuca. Calm, confident, like he had already won. He lit a cigar as he walked toward me. "Nicholas," he greeted. "You have something for me?" I nodded. "In the trunk." DeLuca motioned, and one of his men stepped forward, opening my car's trunk. Empty. Silence. Then, DeLuca chuckled. "You must think I'm stupid." I held his gaze. "No, I think you're done." His smile vanished. That's when the sirens started, loud, close. Floodlights lit up the yard, and a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Victor DeLuca, drop your weapons and surrender immediately." For the first time, I saw something in DeLuca's eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Then everything exploded. Gunfire. Shouting. Chaos. I dove behind a crate as DeLuca's men opened fire, bullets tearing through the night. Daniel's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Nick, move! Feds are sweeping in fast!" I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the nearest SUV, using it for cover as the firefight raged around me. DeLuca was running, not toward his men, not toward safety, toward me. The end of DeLuca. I heard the gunshot before I felt the pain. White-hot fire lanced through my shoulder, knocking me back against the SUV. DeLuca stood a few feet away, gun in hand, breathing hard. "You really thought you could take me down?" he sneered. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand. Blood soaked through my sleeve, but I ignored it. "This isn't your world anymore," I said. "It's over." DeLuca laughed. "Not yet." He raised the gun, and then, bang! DeLuca staggered, his face twisted in shock. He looked down at the bare hole in his chest. Then he collapsed. Behind him, Daniel stood, gun still raised, breathing hard. We locked eyes. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Epilogue, by the time the sun rose, it was over. DeLuca's empire fell in a single night. His men arrested, his accounts frozen, and him buried 6 feet under, where he belonged. I spent 2 days in the hospital, a clean shot, through and through. Lucky. Oliver never left my side, and Daniel, he disappeared after that night. No calls, no messages. I didn't know where he went, but I knew one thing. He saved my life. And if he ever needed me, I'd be there, because no matter what happened, we were still family. The end. 2 months had passed since DeLuca went into the ground. The city had changed. The old power structure was gone. His men were either dead or locked up. The streets were quieter now, almost peaceful. But peace was an illusion. Something was coming. I could feel it. And then, one night, the past came knocking. The letter it arrived at my doorstep. No return address, just a plain envelope, tucked under my door. I tore it open, my heart already hammering. Inside was a single piece of paper, a handwritten note, "Meet me where it all started. Midnight, come alone." No name, no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew that handwriting. Daniel. The meeting, I went armed. Not because I expected a fight, but because I didn't know what to expect. The meeting place was an old warehouse on the east side of town. The same place where Michael and I had first gotten tangled up in DeLuca's world. When I stepped inside, Daniel was already there. He looked different, rougher, more tired, like a man who had seen too much. "Nick," he greeted. I folded my arms. "Took you long enough," he smirked. Had to make sure the dust settled. I glanced around. "Why here?" Daniel exhaled. "Because we're not done." I stiffened. What do you mean? He tossed something onto the table. A folder. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. DeLuca was small time compared to what's coming. I frowned. Coming from where? He hesitated. Then, someone's been cleaning up his mess, moving in on his territory quietly, efficiently. I didn't like where this was going. Who? I asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then he spoke the name. A name I hadn't heard in years. A name I never wanted to hear again. Carmine Vitale. I felt ice settle in my veins. Vitale, the man who ran the East Coast before DeLuca ever took power. The man we thought was dead. I swallowed hard. That's not possible. Daniel met my eyes. Tell that to the bodies piling up. The new enemy. I opened the folder. Photos, surveillance reports, lists of names, people who had gone missing, people who had turned up dead. Vitale wasn't just back. He was erasing anyone who had ever worked for DeLuca. Clearing the board, and then I saw the last page. A name, mine, circled in red ink. I looked up. He's coming for me, Daniel nodded. And he won't stop until you're in the ground. I exhaled slowly, my pulse steadying. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, it was personal. Vitale. The name sat heavy in my mind, a ghost I thought was long buried. DeLuca had been ruthless, but he was predictable. A businessman with a violent streak. Vitale was different. He wasn't just dangerous. He was a legend. A man who disappeared, a decade ago after a purge so brutal that even the old guard feared him. And now he was back, and he wanted me dead. The first move, I closed the folder and looked at Daniel. How long do we have? Not long, he said. Vitale moves fast. He's already picked off the last of DeLuca's inner circle. I wasn't surprised. Men like Vitale didn't make threats. They made examples. I ran a hand down my face. We need to hit first. Daniel smirked. That's what I like to hear. I leaned in. Tell me everything you know. The intel Vitale wasn't operating from the shadows anymore. He had set up shop in a private estate just outside the city. A fortress disguised as a mansion, high walls, armed guards, the whole deal. But the real problem? Corruption. Unlike DeLuca, who bought cops and politicians quietly, Vitale owned people outright, judges, detectives, even federal agents. It meant we had no backup, no one to run to. If we wanted to survive this, we had to do it alone. Daniel flipped open another folder. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow night. Vitale's men are moving something big through the docks. What is it? I asked. Daniel hesitated. We don't know. I frowned. Then we find out. The docks, the next night we watched from the shadows. The docks were crawling with Vitale's men, too many for a simple smuggling job. Something about this didn't feel right. Then I saw him, a man stepping out of a blacked-out SUV, sharp suit, silver hair, ice-cold eyes, Vitale himself. I tensed. He never shows up for routine business. Daniel nodded. Whatever's in those crates, it's important. We needed to know what, and there was only one way to find out. The infiltration, I moved first, slipping through the shadows while Daniel covered me from a rooftop. I took out 2 guards quietly, dragging their bodies into the darkness. Then I reached the first container. Crowbar. Quick pull. The crate opened. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Not drugs, not weapons, but people. Women, young. Terrified human trafficking. Vitale wasn't just reclaiming his empire, he was expanding it. I turned to signal Daniel, and that's when the alarm went off. The chase shouts, gunfire. I ran, weaving, between shipping containers as bullets tore through the night. Daniel's voice crackled in my earpiece. Nick, move! I've got an exit for you! I sprinted toward the fence, but before I could reach it, A car screeched to a stop in front of me. The door opened. Vitale stepped out, calm, controlled, like he had expected this. "Well, well," he said. "Nicholas Calloway, you really should have stayed dead." I gritted my teeth. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Vitale smirked. Then his men grabbed me. I fought. Hard. But it was too late. A gun cracked against my skull. And then, darkness. To be continued. I woke up to pain, a deep throbbing ache in my skull. My arms were heavy, my wrists bound to the arms of a chair, my ankles tied to its legs. Dim light flickered above. Concrete walls, no windows, a basement, and in front of me, Carmine Vitale. He sat in an old leather chair, legs crossed, watching me like I was a puzzle he was about to solve. "You made a mistake, Nicholas," he said, voice smooth. "A big one." I clenched my jaw. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Vitale chuckled. "You always had a smart mouth, just like your brother." I stiffened. "Don't." His smirk deepened. "What? You don't want to talk about Michael? About how he made the same mistake you just did?" I inhaled slowly. Vitale leaned forward. "Did DeLuca ever tell you why your brother died?" I said nothing. Of course he didn't. Vitale smiled. "Because DeLuca didn't kill him." A darker truth I swallowed hard. "You're lying." Vitale's expression didn't change. "Am I?" I wanted to deny it, to call him a liar, but something in his voice, something too certain, made my gut twist. "Michael was useful," Vitale continued. "Smart, loyal. But then he got curious, started asking the wrong questions, digging into things that weren't his business. I knew that feeling all too well. So I gave him a choice," Vitale said. "Walk away, or take a bullet." My hands clenched into fists. "And your brother?" Vitale smiled coldly. "He was stubborn, just like you." I could barely breathe. All these years, I thought DeLuca had Michael killed. But it was Vitale, the man sitting across from me. I forced myself to speak. "You think telling me this makes you untouchable?" Vitale chuckled. "No, Nicholas. I think telling you this makes you understand." He stood, stepping closer. "I don't need to kill you. I just need you to see reason. You're in over your head. I own this city, the cops, the judges. You have nothing." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You sure about that?" Vitale frowned. That's when the first explosion rocked the building, the escape. The blast shook the walls, sending dust raining from the ceiling. Vitale spun toward the door, barking orders. That's when I moved. He was distracted. I braced against the chair and snapped the armrest with everything I had. Pain shot through my wrist, but the binding loosened. Another explosion, closer this time. Screams echoed through the hall. "Gunfire! Daniel!" I ripped free from the chair, just as one of Vitale's. Men ran inside. He barely had time to react before I drove the broken chair leg into his throat. He gurgled, staggered, and collapsed. I grabbed his gun. Vitale had already bolted for the door. I sprinted after him, weaving through the smoke-filled corridor. Bodies littered the ground. His men, taken out by precise shots. Daniel was good. Too good. I reached the stairwell just in time to see Vitale shoving through a side door, escaping into the night. I wasn't letting him go. Not after what he told me. Not after what he did. The final confrontation. Outside, chaos reigned. Vitale's men were dead or running. Daniel stood near a black SUV, rifle in hand. He saw me and nodded toward the docks. "Vitale's making a run for it." I didn't hesitate. I ran. Vitale was already at the water's edge, shoving a bleeding man off a speedboat. He turned as I approached, raising a pistol. I fired first. His gun flew from his hand as my bullet tore through his wrist. He staggered, but he didn't fall. Instead, he laughed. "You really are your brother's shadow, aren't you?" he rasped. I stepped closer, gun leveled. Say his name again. Vitale smiled. Michael was a fool, just like you. I pulled the trigger. Single shot. Vitale fell back, hitting the dock hard. His breath rattled once, then stopped. It was over. For real this time. Epilogue. The city felt different in the days after. Quieter. Lighter. Vitale's empire crumbled overnight. The people he owned turned on each other. His fortune disappeared into police evidence lockers. And me? I finally visited Michael's grave. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning in the past. Oliver was safe. Daniel disappeared. Again, as he always did. But I knew he was out there watching, waiting, because trouble always finds men like us. And when it does, we'll be ready. The end. Months had passed since we buried Carmine Vitale. The city was still recovering from the chaos, the power vacuum left in his wake, creating an opening for anyone hungry enough to fill it. But things had settled, at least on the surface. On the outside, I was just another man, trying to move on from the ghosts of the past. But the past doesn't let go so easily, does it? The quiet. Before the storm, I was at the office when the phone rang. I stared at the screen for a moment, seeing the number flash before me. It was a New York area code, but the name was unfamiliar. I picked it up. Calloway. Mr. Calloway, a cool voice replied. I think you've been expecting me. I frowned. I'm sorry. Who is this? The voice chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You can call me Mr. Black for now. It's what people in our line of work call me. I felt my stomach tighten. I don't know you. Perhaps you don't, he said, the amusement fading from his tone. But I know you. I know your family's history, the secrets you think you buried. You and your brother weren't the only ones playing in the shadows. I froze. What do you want? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he spoke again, his voice low and lethal. You've been a thorn in my side for a while now, Calloway. The death of Vitale wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. You're going to help me clean up that mess. Or, well, let's just say there's still plenty of things left behind that I think you'll want to keep buried. My heart raced. You're threatening me? You're not listening, he said, his voice colder than before. I'm offering you a choice, Calloway, a partnership. Help me take care of the loose ends, and I'll make sure your family's name stays out of the news. Don't help me, and I'll make sure everything you've done, the lies, the betrayals, the bloodshed, comes to light, not just for you, but for everyone. I clenched my teeth. Who the hell are you? The voice on the line chuckled again, but this time there was no humor. Does it matter? He asked. Because you're going to help me, Nicholas. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time. Mr. Black. Whoever he was, he knew too much. He had his claws in deeper than I ever imagined, and he wasn't going to let go. The new enemy Daniel found me in the office a few hours later. You look like someone ran over your dog, he said, leaning against the door frame. Get in here, I muttered, waving him in. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. What's going on? I tossed the phone on the desk, recounting the conversation with Mr. Black. Daniel's expression darkened. This isn't good. You think? You didn't recognize the voice? Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing. I shook my head. I've never heard of him before. Daniel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. That's the problem. Whoever he is, he's organized. This isn't just some random player trying to take over. I leaned back in my chair. So what now? Daniel studied me for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. We dig. We find out who Mr. Black is, and we take the fight to him before he has the chance to put his plan into motion. I nodded. And if we don't? We'll be dead before the week's out. The investigation, we hit the streets. Daniel had connections, old friends in low places, men and women who owed him favors. For the first time in a long while, I found myself working the same kind of angles I had when I was younger, when I was trying to survive in a city that had no place for men like me, but every lead led us to the same dead end. Mr. Black wasn't just one person. He was an organization, a shadow network that had been quietly pulling strings for years, maybe even decades. And whoever he was connected to people who were untouchable. Politicians, cops, judges, the kind of people who had the power to make you disappear without a trace. We were out of time. The revelation. I was sitting in a dimly lit bar that night, nursing a whiskey, when Daniel slid into the booth across from me. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed me a file. I opened it slowly, scanning through the pages. There, on the last page, was a picture. A man. He looked familiar, but it wasn't until I saw the name beneath the picture that everything clicked into place. Tommy Fisher. The name hit me like a sledgehammer. Fisher was a ghost, a name whispered in the same circles as Vitale's, but never confirmed. A ghost who'd supposedly died in an accident years ago, but now I saw it clearly. Tommy Fisher had faked his death, and now he was back, using the alias Mr. Black to rise from the shadows. I sat back, stunned. Fisher. It was him all along. Daniel nodded. It's always been him. You were never the target, Nick. Fisher's been playing everyone. You, DeLuca, even Vitale. He's been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. I slammed my fist against the table. How the hell do we take him down? Daniel's eyes glinted with something dark. We go to war. The clock was ticking. Tommy Fisher, or Mr. Black as he liked to call himself, had slipped through our fingers for far too long. His operation was massive, a tangled web of corruption, power, and deceit that spanned the highest echelons of the city. Politicians, law enforcement, corporate magnates. Every system was compromised, but we had him now, and it was time to end it. The plan Daniel and I spent the next few days preparing. We couldn't just rush in blind. Fisher's empire wasn't something you could dismantle without serious planning. We needed allies. The first person I reached out to was someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Catherine. She had worked with me during the DeLuca years, one of the few people I truly trusted in this mess of a city. She had connections of her own, information that could get us close to Fisher's inner circle without getting ourselves killed in the process. I met her in an old diner on the outskirts of the city. Her blonde hair was a little shorter now, her face more hardened by time. But her eyes were the same, sharp, calculating. "You're still alive, huh?" she said, taking a seat across from me. "Against all odds," I replied, giving her a wry smile. "I need your help." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "And why would I help you?" "Because Fisher's been running the game from behind the scenes," I said. "And if you don't help, he'll destroy everything you've worked for." Her gaze softened just a little. She knew better than anyone the kind of power Fisher wielded. "All right, I'm in, but you owe me, Nick. Big time." I nodded. "Deal." The stakeout Catherine's intel pointed us toward Fisher's most recent hideout, a high-rise building with layers of security, guards, cameras, biometric locks, the whole 9 yards. He wasn't just hiding in the shadows anymore. He was brazen, confident, but confidence can make a man sloppy. The night of the operation, we moved carefully. The city's streets buzzed with the usual chaos, but we were ghosts in the crowd. Daniel, Catherine, and I slipped through the underground tunnels that led to the building's parking garage. It was our entry point, the only way to get close. Enough without setting off alarms. We kept our heads down and our eyes open. Inside the garage, I saw the first signs of Fisher's security. Armed men watching every corner. They weren't just security. They were professionals. "I count at least 5, Daniel whispered, his eyes scanning the area. "We take them quietly?" "Quiet is the key," I said. "We move fast. No mistakes. The infiltration." The first guard went down without a sound. Catherine had him in a chokehold before he even knew what hit him. The second tried to reach for his gun, but Daniel was quicker, taking him out with a swift blow to the head. We moved fast. No talking, no hesitation. Each step brought us closer to Fisher. But every corner was a risk, every shadow a potential trap. When we reached the elevator, I hit the button and looked at the others. This is it. No turning back now. Catherine's face was unreadable. "Ready when you are." The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. As the doors closed behind us, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Movement in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. Too late. The doors opened, and we were face to face with 2 more guards. I didn't wait for the first shot to be fired. I lunged, knocking one out cold with a sharp elbow to the temple. Daniel and Catherine moved in tandem, dispatching the remaining men in seconds. "Keep moving," I said, as we stormed down the hallway. The end of the hall was just ahead. It was where Fisher's office would be, the place where all the strings were being pulled. The final confrontation. I knew what would happen once we reached that door. It wouldn't be a clean fight. Fisher was too smart to leave himself unprotected. He'd have layers of defenses, men hidden everywhere. But I also knew that this was the moment everything had been leading up to. We couldn't afford to fail. I took a breath, pushing through the door, and there he was, Tommy Fisher, sitting at his desk, looking as calm as ever. The man didn't even flinch when he saw us. "Did you really think it would be this easy, Nicholas?" he said, the smile never leaving his lips. "You've underestimated me for the last time," I said, stepping forward. "It ends tonight." Fisher's smirk only widened. He didn't move from his chair, but his eyes flicked to the side. And that's when I heard it. A click. Then, the sound of guns being drawn from every corner of the room. I had known he'd be prepared, but I hadn't anticipated this. The twist from. The shadows emerged, several men, dressed in the same black suits as Fisher's elite guards. They had us surrounded. The odds had shifted. Fisher stood, finally. "You were always predictable, Nick. You thought you could play the game with me. You thought you could outsmart me. But the truth is I was always 5 steps ahead." He raised his hand. The world slowed down. The gunshot that had echoed through the room seemed to stretch out, each second hanging heavy in the air, as though everything was unfolding in slow motion. But it wasn't the bullet that struck me. It was the look on Catherine's face. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at Daniel. Her eyes were locked on Fisher, and in that brief moment I understood. Catherine wasn't just here to help me. She wasn't just a friend, an ally in a dangerous game. She was playing her own hand. The chaos erupted. In a blur of gunfire, and I was thrown to the floor, instinctively pulling Daniel down with me as shots rang out around us. But we weren't the target anymore. It was Fisher. The guards who had surrounded us were suddenly turning their guns on him. I watched in shock as Fisher stumbled back, confusion flashing in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. Not from Catherine, but she didn't hesitate. She moved with precision, stepping forward and drawing a sleek silver pistol from her jacket. Her aim was steady as she leveled the weapon at Fisher. "You," she whispered, her voice cold, "were always my real target." Fisher's eyes widened in disbelief. "You!" But the sentence never finished. The bullet hit him square between the eyes. The man who had been the puppet master, who had orchestrated death and betrayal, crumpled in his chair, a look of shock frozen on his face. His reign was over. The aftermath. The room was deathly silent for a moment. The gunfire had stopped. Fisher was dead, and the guards who had turned on him were left standing, unsure of what to do next. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was still, processing what had just happened. Catherine lowered the gun, her expression unreadable as she glanced at us. I told you it was going to end tonight. I pushed myself to my feet slowly, my mind racing to piece everything together. Catherine, you were working for him? All this time? She let out a dry laugh, the kind that made my skin crawl. Not for him. Against him. You were never the real target, Nicholas. Neither was DeLuca. This entire time I've been working to bring down Fisher my way. I stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. You've been using me. Catherine's eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to me. Not using you. I needed you alive. To take down Vitale. To take down everything Fisher had built. It was a slow burn. But Fisher... She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Fisher was too careful, too paranoid. He didn't trust anyone. That was his weakness. He thought he had it all figured out. He thought he was the one pulling all the strings. And you were waiting for the right moment to cut him loose, I said, the realization dawning on me. She nodded. Exactly. The truth. About Catherine. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel betrayed. But the truth was, I couldn't. Not when everything she said made sense. Not when I could feel the weight of her words, her meticulous planning, and the years of patience behind them. Fisher hadn't been the only puppet master. Catherine had been quietly pulling her own strings, waiting for the perfect time to take him down. But what did it all mean now? So, what happens now? Daniel asked, his voice sharp and cautious. Catherine looked between the two of us, her gaze, assessing. Now, we make sure his empire stays down. I've got enough on everyone in this city to make sure that no one else tries to take Fisher's place. And you think you'll just walk away from all this? I asked, a bitter chuckle, escaping my lips. Her smile faded. I'm not walking away. I'm staying in the shadows where I've always been. I've been alone in this fight for far too long, and now it's over. You and Daniel can clean up the rest. I shook my head. You think I'm going to walk away from this? You think I'm going to let you just fade into the background after everything you've done? She raised an eyebrow. You're not in charge here, Nicholas. This was never your fight. The choices we make, the tension between us, was thick, but as I looked at her, I realized something. I had been living in the shadows for too long. My life had been one betrayal after another, one twist after another, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for a change. It was time to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. Then what? I asked, my voice steady. We just let you walk away into the darkness? Catherine's eyes flickered with something like regret, but she didn't answer immediately. She let the silence sit between us, heavy and pregnant with meaning. I'm not walking away, she finally said. I'm just choosing where my fight ends, and for me it ends here. There was a finality to her tone. But I knew better. The long shadow. We stood in the remains of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of everything that had been. Fisher's empire was gone, but the city was still alive, still breathing, still ready to fill the void left behind.